In just 47 seconds, what started as political banter would explode into the most brutal on-air meltdown in late-night television history. A respected congresswoman's composed facade would crack under relentless provocation, leading to a verbal assault so fierce it would leave audiences stunned and a seasoned host scrambling for damage control. Last night's episode of Gutfeld delivered exactly that kind of television carnage when Representative Jasmine Crockett walked into what she thought would be standard political commentary, but instead found herself trapped in a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to humiliate and destroy. The studio lights were blazing hot as Crockett settled into the guest chair, her professional smile masking what would soon become barely contained fury. Gutfeld, smirking behind his desk with that trademark condescending grin, had clearly done his homework on ways to get under her skin. The show's opening segment had been relatively tame, touching on recent legislative developments and policy disagreements, but veteran viewers could sense something sinister brewing beneath the surface. Gutfeld's questions carried an edge sharper than usual, each one designed not to inform but to provoke. "So, Congresswoman Crockett," Gutfeld began, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated casualness, "tell us about your recent comments regarding border security. You seemed pretty passionate about keeping our borders wide open for anyone who wants to stroll in." The mischaracterization was deliberate and obvious, but Crockett maintained her composure, correcting the record with measured precision. "That's not accurate, Greg. What I said was that we need comprehensive immigration reform that addresses both security concerns and humanitarian obligations." But Gutfeld wasn't interested in nuanced policy discussions. He was hunting for a reaction, and his next move revealed just how far he was willing to go to get it. "Right. Humanitarian obligations," he repeated mockingly, making air quotes with his fingers. "Is that what we're calling it when communities like yours benefit financially from federal programs designed to help these migrants? Some might call that a conflict of interest, but I guess that's just good business for certain districts." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Crockett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady as she responded. "That's a disgusting insinuation, and you know it. My district supports comprehensive immigration reform because it's the right thing to do for America, not because of some imaginary financial benefit you're suggesting exists." Gutfeld's grin widened. He could smell blood in the water now, and like a shark, he moved in for a deeper bite. "Imaginary? Really? Because the numbers don't lie, Congresswoman. Your district has received millions in federal funding related to immigration services. But hey, I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? Just like it's a coincidence that you've been one of the loudest voices opposing any real border enforcement measures." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Gutfeld's usual supporters could sense that he was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Crockett's media training was being put to the ultimate test, as she fought to maintain professional decorum, while her host systematically attacked her integrity and motives. "What you're doing right now is exactly why people have lost faith in media," Crockett fired back, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You're not interested in honest debate about policy differences. You're interested in character assassination and spreading conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality." Gutfeld's laugh was cold and calculating. "Character assassination? I'm just asking questions based on publicly available information. If you don't like the implications, maybe you should look at your own voting record instead of attacking the messenger." He paused for effect, letting the tension build before delivering his next verbal blow. "Unless, of course, asking tough questions about potential conflicts of interest is now considered off-limits for certain members of Congress." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. Gutfeld was suggesting that Crockett was somehow above scrutiny, playing into tired narratives about privilege and special treatment. Crockett's composure was beginning to crack, and viewers at home could see the storm clouds gathering in her expression. "You want to talk about asking tough questions?" Crockett's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Let's talk about your track record of spreading misinformation and dividing communities for ratings. Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on punching down and targeting people who actually try to make a difference in this world." But Gutfeld wasn't backing down. If anything, her pushback only energized him further. The sadistic gleam in his eyes suggested he was exactly where he wanted to be, in complete control of a situation spiraling toward chaos. Oh, so now I'm the problem, not the congresswoman who can't answer simple questions about her policy positions without playing the victim card? The phrase, victim card, landed like a slap across Crockett's face. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap, and for a moment, the mask of political professionalism slipped entirely. Victim card? Are you serious right now? You invite me on your show, ambush me with bullshit accusations about corruption, and when I defend myself, you accuse me of playing victim? Her voice was rising now, the careful modulation of political speech giving way to raw human emotion. Gutfeld leaned forward, sensing he was on the verge of achieving exactly what he'd planned from the beginning. I'm just saying that maybe if you spent less time making excuses and more time actually representing your constituents effectively, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I guess that's harder than blaming everyone else for your problems, isn't it? The studio fell into dead silence. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as they witnessed what was clearly building toward an unprecedented television moment. Crockett stared at Gutfeld with a mixture of disbelief and pure rage, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to process the depths of his unprofessional conduct. What happened next would transform a standard political interview into the kind of television spectacle that breaks the internet and ends careers, as two strong personalities prepared for a collision that would leave only one standing. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds before Crockett exploded, with a fury that caught even Gutfeld off guard. You know what? I'm done with this shit, she snarled, her professional mask finally shattering completely. You want to sit there and question my integrity? You want to imply that I'm somehow corrupt or self-serving? Let's talk about corruption, Greg. Let's talk about you. Gutfeld's smirk faltered for the first time all evening. He hadn't expected her to go on the offensive, and certainly not with such raw, unfiltered aggression. Now hold on, he began. But Crockett wasn't finished. Not even close. No, you hold on. She cut him off with a voice that could slice steel. You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my reputation with baseless accusations and gotcha questions. So now it's my turn to ask some questions. How much money have you made spreading lies and division? How much cash have you pocketed by turning Americans against each other for entertainment? The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Gutfeld tried to regain control of the situation with a nervous laugh. Congresswoman, I think you're taking this a little too personally. Personally? Crockett's voice rose to a near shout. You attack my character, my motives, my district, and my work, and I'm taking it too personally? Are you out of your goddamn mind? The curse word hit like a thunderclap in the sterile studio environment, and several audience members audibly gasped. Gutfeld's face was turning red now, his own composure beginning to crack under the unexpected assault. Look, if you can't handle basic journalistic questions without having a meltdown. Journalistic? Crockett laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. Is that what you call this garbage? Journalism? You wouldn't know real journalism if it bit you in your privileged ass. What you do isn't journalism, Greg. It's propaganda wrapped in cheap jokes and served up to people who are too lazy to think for themselves. The personal attack hit its mark. Gutfeld's trademark smugness was evaporating before the cameras, replaced by genuine anger. That's rich coming from someone whose entire political career is built on identity politics and victimhood narratives. At least I'm honest about what I do instead of pretending to be some kind of crusader for justice. Identity politics? Crockett's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper again, and everyone in the studio could feel the temperature plummet. Let me tell you something about identity politics. You ignorant piece of shit. My identity is being a black woman who had to work twice as hard as mediocre men like you just to get half the recognition. My identity is representing people who have been ignored and marginalized while you profit off their pain. The racial dimension of the confrontation had now been explicitly introduced, and Gutfeld realized he was walking into a minefield. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with characteristic recklessness. And there it is, he said with renewed confidence. The race card. I wondered how long it would take you to pull that one out of your bag of tricks. The phrase, race card, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Crockett's entire body went rigid, and for a moment, She looked like she might physically leap across the desk. Race card? She repeated slowly, each word dripping with venom. Did you just say race card to me? You think acknowledging the reality of racism in America is playing a card? Gutfeld sensed he had pushed too far but seemed unable to stop himself. I'm just saying that maybe instead of blaming everything on racism, you could focus on actual solutions. But I guess that's harder than just pointing fingers and demanding special treatment. The words special treatment were the final straw. Crockett stood up so abruptly that her chair nearly toppled backward. Special treatment? Special fucking treatment? Her voice was now loud enough to be heard in the parking lot. The only special treatment I see is the treatment that allows mediocre white men like you to fail upward while spreading hate and division for profit. Gutfeld was now visibly rattled, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something approaching panic. He had clearly underestimated Crockett's willingness to fight fire with fire, and now the situation was spiraling completely out of his control. Congresswoman, I think we need to take a step back here. No, we're not taking a step back. Crockett cut him off, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found her footing in battle. You wanted a fight, Greg. You spent months preparing for this moment, didn't you? You researched every angle, every potential weakness, every button you could push to try to humiliate me on national television. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. The accuracy of her assessment was written all over Gutfeld's face. This had indeed been a carefully planned ambush, and she had just called him out on it in front of millions of viewers. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, as he struggled to formulate a response. The difference between us, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word, is that I actually stand for something. I fight for people who need fighting for. You're just a sad little man who builds his career on tearing down people who are actually trying to make a difference in this world. Gutfeld finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate squeak. That's completely unfair, and you know it. I provide commentary on important issues. Commentary, Crockett interrupted with another humorless laugh. Is that what we're calling bigotry and misinformation now? Commentary? You don't comment on issues, Greg. You manufacture outrage and sell it to people who are already angry at the world. You're not a comedian or a journalist. You're a hate merchant. The phrase, hate merchant, clearly struck a nerve. Gutfeld's face was now beet red, and his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped his desk. That is absolutely ridiculous. I have never promoted hate of any kind. Bullshit, Crockett shot back without hesitation. Your entire brand is built on othering people like me. You make your living convincing your audience that people who look like me, think like me, or represent communities like mine are somehow the enemy. That's not comedy, Greg. That's not entertainment. That's hate, pure and simple. The confrontation had now reached a point of no return. Both participants were operating on pure adrenaline and fury, with all pretense of professional discourse completely abandoned. The studio crew was frantically signaling for commercial breaks, but neither Gutfeld nor Crockett seemed aware of anything beyond their mutual destruction. What started as a calculated attempt to embarrass a political opponent had transformed into something much more dangerous, a raw exposure of the toxic dynamics that poison American political discourse. And as both combatants prepared for their final, most devastating exchanges, it became clear that this television moment would have consequences far beyond the studio walls. Gutfeld, desperate to regain some semblance of control, made the fatal mistake of going even lower. You know what, Congresswoman? Maybe if you spent less time playing victim and more time actually doing your job, your district wouldn't be such a mess. But I guess it's easier to come on shows like this and throw tantrums when someone asks you real questions about your failures. The word tantrums was the match that ignited the final explosion. Crockett's eyes blazed with a fury so intense that several audience members actually leaned back in their seats. Tantrums? She repeated, her voice now carrying the weight of generations of women who had been dismissed and belittled by men like Gutfeld. Did this pathetic excuse for a human being just call my response to his racist, sexist bullshit a tantrum? Gutfeld realized too late that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Now, wait a minute. I never said anything racist. Don't you dare. Crockett cut him off with a voice that could shatter glass. Don't you fucking dare try to gaslight me and everyone watching this train wreck. You've spent the entire interview using every dog whistle in the book, questioning my integrity, my motives, my right to even be here. And now you want to pretend you're innocent? The congresswoman began pacing behind her chair like a caged lioness, her fury too great to contain in one position. You want to talk about failures, Greg? Let's talk about your failures. You failed as a comedian because you're not funny. You failed as a journalist because you don't seek truth. You failed as a human being because you've built your entire identity around tearing down people who are actually trying to make the world better. Gutfeld's face had gone from red to purple, and his voice cracked as he tried to respond. That's completely out of line. Out of line? Crockett whirled around to face him directly, her movements sharp and predatory. You think I'm out of line? You ambush me on your show, attack my character with lies and conspiracy theories, dismiss my legitimate responses as tantrums, and I'm out of line for calling you out on your bullshit? The studio was now in complete chaos. Producers were frantically trying to cut to commercial, but the control room seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a heated political debate. This was a complete breakdown of civilized discourse, and it was happening live on national television. I've had enough of this, Gutfeld finally managed to say, his voice weak and desperate. If you can't conduct yourself professionally, maybe you should leave. Crockett laughed, a sound so cold and sharp it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Oh, now you want to talk about professionalism. After you spent the entire interview acting like a petulant child throwing stones at someone who actually has the courage to fight for what's right, you think you get to decide when this conversation ends? She moved closer to his desk, and Gutfeld actually leaned back in his chair as if seeking escape. Let me tell you something, you cowardly little man. I came here tonight thinking I was going to have a conversation with a professional, even if I disagreed with your politics. Instead, I found a pathetic bully who gets his kicks from trying to humiliate people who threaten his fragile worldview. Gutfeld made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Security, we need. Don't you dare call security on me. Crockett's voice boomed across the studio with such authority that even the security personnel hesitated. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply telling the truth about what kind of person you really are. And you can't handle it. She grabbed her purse and began walking toward the exit, but stopped and turned back for one final, devastating blow. You know what the real tragedy is, Greg? You actually had a platform. You had an opportunity to inform people, to bring them together, to make a positive difference in the world. Instead, you chose to be a merchant of division and hate. You chose to profit off the worst instincts of human nature, instead of appealing to the best. Gutfeld sat frozen behind his desk, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to formulate any response. The man who made his living with quick comebacks and clever insults had been reduced to stunned silence by the sheer force of Crockett's moral authority. And that's why you'll always be a failure, no matter how many ratings you get or how much money you make, Crockett continued, her voice now carrying a tone of almost pitying contempt. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with the knowledge that you chose to make the world worse instead of better. You chose to spread poison instead of healing. You chose to be on the wrong side of history. The studio fell into absolute silence as Crockett walked toward the exit. Even the cameramen seemed frozen in place, unsure whether to keep filming or look away from what felt like a public execution. Gutfeld remained slumped in his chair, his trademark smugness completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to shame. Just before reaching the door, Crockett turned back one final time. Oh, and Greg, the next time you want to ambush someone who actually fights for justice, maybe pick on someone who didn't grow up dealing with bullies like you every single day of their life. Because this? She gestured at the wreckage of the interview set. This is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. With that, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked out of the studio, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the brutal dismantling he had just endured on live television. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any of the shouting that had preceded it. Gutfeld sat alone at his desk for several long seconds, the weight of his humiliation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his defeat for posterity. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We'll be right back after these messages," he mumbled. But everyone knew the show was already over. The credits began to roll over the image of a broken man who had finally met someone who refused to be intimidated by his brand of toxic masculinity and manufactured outrage. The confrontation would become the most watched clip in late-night television history, not because of its entertainment value, but because it represented a moment of truth in an era of lies. Jasmine Crockett had done more than just defend herself. She had held up a mirror to the ugliness of modern media culture and forced everyone to see their reflection. The reckoning was complete, and justice, for once, had been served.